Any unit that gets adapted from a mainline game to Fire Emblem Heroes isn't always going to be a one-to-one replica with how they were in their base game. Sometimes they could be relatively close to that counterpart, sometimes they could be on the complete opposite spectrum, and sometimes they could be relatively faithful in some areas, whether that's replicating PRF skills or just relative niches in general. However, for some characters that were expected to get into the game as relatively massive powerhouses, a fair amount of them were shocked as they were the complete opposite of that. Here are some of the most notable characters throughout the entire series that got into Fire Emblem Heroes as a regular or mediocre unit. I do want to set some ground rules really quick because this isn't an easy one-to-one comparison given that they're different mediums. That being said, you can definitely tell with some of these additions that some of them were definitely not treated as well as they could have been. Either way, they keep it much more simplistic. We're not going to include any seasonals, or we're not going to include any dancers, because if we had dancers then the list would be much more bloated. Rarely has there ever been a bad dancer, if you could even name one. Likewise, I want to keep it to their first on-debut edition, aka how they got into the game first, and their subsequent refine if they did get one. And I might bring up the addition of future editions just for reference points, but otherwise it's really just going to be covering their base versions. So going all the way back to FE1, we have Jagen, who is our pre-promote unit that had a silver lance with early game viability. This is where the whole terminology came from because this is really how the role went. They have really good viability at the beginning of the game, and sometimes they can be used to clutch in kills or chip damage for units to gain XP from. Usually they ended up being a really early promote, or they came promoted so that they have much more stats at the beginning, but usually they end up falling off a bit into the game. That's what people tend to call their Jagens. However, Jagen got into the game as a mediocre Lance Cav unit with veteran BST, which for those who don't know is more or less just known as hindered BST. They get less BST than their subsequent counterparts because they're veterans, and that's really about it. It is funny though that he did come with a silver lance, but it didn't really fix his issues whatsoever, having low attack, mediocre speed, and low defense. He was more so known for just having good res, but that was about it. And they did play into that a bit more when it came to his refine because they did give him a sabotage weapon, but it didn't really help him stand out all too much at the end of the day. At this point, if you are going to run him, you would be using an arcane weapon, which more or less just makes him like every other generic Lance Cav at this point. However, if we're talking about a bit more of a redemption, we have Silk. Silk was mainly known for her warping capabilities because in Gaiden, that was a map-wide effect. You can bring them anywhere you wanted, didn't matter just because you had warp. Obviously, they balanced it out way later into the series, but at the time, that was considered one of the most broken things in there, just being able to go anywhere across the map because yes, obviously she didn't get that in Heroes. That would have been insanely broken, but you figured maybe she would get something at the very least. She did come with Melancholy Plus, which was an okay staff, but otherwise she was just one of those really mediocre pity breakers that you could have gotten. And at the very least, her refine wasn't bad by any means, although it didn't shoot her to the top of viability by any means. As after combat healing, it grants stats, guard, all sorts of stuff, and it's a relatively nice mixed utility weapon, but it's again not really something that made her stand out all too much. At the very least, it was a weapon that she could use, unlike Pala, who didn't really get that. Pala from FE3 was an early joining recruit that had really good BST, and because she came at a relatively high level, it was very easy to promote her on that same chapter. One of the bigger perks too is that she was a flyer, so you could always go around a lot of the mountains and water tiles that did plague a lot of the maps, and because of that, she was relatively known as one of the better units that you could have in that game, especially early in. In Faye, however, really wasn't the case. Something that you'll notice for a lot of these units on this list is that a lot of their movement capabilities were never really taken into account because for the longest time, they weren't really able to take advantage of it. And a good amount of the map design for a very long time really didn't necessarily benefit flyers. Even though it wasn't a bad thing by any means, there just wasn't as much of an immediate benefit to running a flyer as there was any other archetype. Nowadays, they do have stuff like Guidance, which is incredible for support, Guard Bearing 4, Gambit, so on and so forth, but that's more so of a flyer perk than a Pala thing specifically. Pala got in with a Triangle Adept Sword, aka Ruby Sword. It didn't really help her stand out all too much because she wasn't exactly the best when it came to the stat department, although most of her competition really came from Sheeta, who wasn't exactly great either. Even then, she ended up getting a refine that doubled down on the Triangle Adept effectiveness, meaning that her combat capabilities weren't nearly as great as her contemporaries, or even her sisters who got the same refine effect, but with their base effects in tow. Catcher with Slaying and Est for armor effectiveness, which was also really useful for arena purposes at its time. And while I would definitely say she's in a much better position at this point, given all the inheritables that we do have, Hala for the longest while wasn't really that great. Although she does have her Valentian version, which is a really solid variant, but as far as the base version went, she could have definitely done better. And now moving on to FE4 and Jugdro in general, I have 2 units on here that I don't think are necessarily fair to keep on just because of how they were in their base game, but I did want to put them on here just because I thought it was funny. Those being Sigurd and Ivel, but I'll get to Ivel once I finish up FE4. Sigurd in particular was very much known for being one of the strongest units across the entire series. He had incredible stats, decent growths, was a mounted unit, which is one of the most important things in genealogy, had pursuit. He could pretty much solo the entirety of Gen 1 if you really wanted him to. He was that absurd. And when he got into Fae, I wouldn't even say he was bad by any means. He was built to quote-unquote counter Reinhardt because of Crusader's Ward and his weapon having magic deflection, which it was kind of a meme because I'm pretty sure he couldn't even kill Reinhardt on the player fates anyway. It's less that he was bad and just that he wasn't nearly as game-breaking until his legendary variant came out, which even to this day still has pretty decent usage. He did get a nice refine for what it's worth in Divine Tearfang, granting a good amount of attack and defense and a guaranteed follow-up, making it so he could get more consistent damage output, although that is definitely more outdated at this point due to arcanes. Either way, he just wasn't as broken as he was in FE4, which makes sense in its own retrospect. But the other reason I wanted to put it on here is because unlike Sigurd, Ira ended up becoming one of the most meta-defining units at that time because of Regnal Astra's really absurd damage output. 40% of her own speed at the time, where she was one of the fastest units in the game, on top of the fact that she had Desperation and a flashing blade weapon. She was a very powerful unit for her time. And as I did mention in the beginning, it is hard to do a one-to-one comparison for a lot of these units, but it was clear that they could easily make some units way more obnoxious if they really wanted to, and Ira was definitely one of those. And I can definitely tell you, Ira was definitely not as good in FE4 as she was in Fae at her peak. And speaking of which, Arthur. Actually, I don't know if that's speaking of which. Either way, it's genealogy. Arthur. He is a generic infantry mage in Fae, and that's about it. He has good stats. You probably don't want him as a pity breaker. That's about it. There's really not much going on for him there. And what makes Arthur interesting is that he's not always guaranteed to be this game-breaking unit in FE4, but it's also relatively easy to do that if you give him Forseti blood, because he's able to inherit Forseti. Likewise, he comes with Wrath and can be promoted into a mount, which fixes not only so many of his damage output issues, but also his movement issues. He could be an incredible sweeper if you really need him to be. Can't really do much with that at the moment. Although if we're talking about really bad treatment, he definitely got a bit more leeway comparatively to Ivel, who again is probably one of those funny entries here, just because one of her biggest things from Thracia is that she has a dodge death exploit, where the game made it so she can't actually die in the game because she has to be turned into stone in one of the later chapters. You do get her back in 24x, but she's not really good by that point because her stats fell off, but you're not really using her at that point. It's really just for story purposes more than anything. Anyway, for those who aren't familiar with Thracia, one of the biggest things with Ivel is that you could pretty much just throw her in front of the enemy lines, even though it's not recommended because she'll eat up all your XP, but she can't actually die in the game, and the game is programmed to miss every single attack if it does end up killing her. I think that's how it went, but the point being is that it was literally impossible to get her killed, which was really funny in some instances, because if you wanted her to chip down specific units with the flame sword or the fire sword or whatever it was called, you could absolutely do that. Obviously, she didn't get that treatment in Heroes, but it was definitely a lot worse than expected. She was considered one of the worst pity breakers at the time. She had a mediocre stat spread, and while I would say her refine definitely made her much more appealing, she's in a very bloated archetype to where you wouldn't necessarily run her over a lot of the other god swords, but at the same time, she's not doing all too bad. But on debut, it was not exactly the best either. Although sharing with Ivo on that banner, we had Ocean, who also came with Vuj, which I hope I pronounced correctly. Just like in Thracia, it is a 1-2 ranged weapon in Heroes. However, it is conditional, and it's still due for a refine. It might actually get refined next month, but who knows with this game. Either way, it is a 1-2 ranged axe. He has Wrath, and he could use scroll support, which can make him really obnoxious in that game. In Heroes, it's just a slaying conditional distant counter weapon, and he could be easily gimped because he didn't exactly have the best stat spread. He has good good attack, and that's about it. He came out at a point where distant counter weapons weren't exactly considered good, and you could definitely argue that a lot of them aren't really considered that great even to this day. But I think the big difference between when he came out and nowadays is that there's just a lot more competitive A slots at this point. So for what it's worth, he can still take advantage of a lot of decent fodder. That being said, most people who probably do run him are probably running his PRF at the moment, and if he does end up getting a good refine, then hey, you know what, this will just age poorly, which, you know what, I'm all for. And lastly, on the Thracia list, we have Asbel, who I'm not exactly too sure on how people really consider him. I know he doesn't exactly start out all too great, but he does have Graph Caliber both in Thracia and Heroes. And from what I remember, he does also have decent enough growths. But I think the big thing was definitely from Graph Caliber because of its high crit and low weight. Crit in Heroes is more so just the slaying effect. He got an okay-ish PRF, but it wasn't really anything that let him stand out at the time, especially when we had somebody like Young Merrick and Lewin, who were considered some of the best green mages at that point. There was one thing that he could do, which was relatively funny in retrospect because I'm pretty sure he was very squishy in Thracia, is that he could potentially take an enemy face hit if needed in Heroes, but that was only by some extent. Obviously, if he took multiple hits in succession, he was just going to die, but comparatively to a lot of the other green mages, he was definitely a lot more bulky. But now we probably get into some of the worst examples in all of this. Melody, Percival, and Rutger from FE6, who are considered some of the best units in that game respectively. All three of them had their own unique traits that allowed them to stand out relatively well. They all had good stats, but Melody had Flier, Rescue, and Terrain gimmicks, and could also get the ability to remove her Flier weakness. Percival had really good weapon variety, being able to use all sorts of lances and swords, but also had the ability to use axes, and Rutger was a very early recruit who had really good bases, good accuracy, and is considered one of the best boss killers in the game. There's a reason why this image exists, and it's the whole funny 102 crit. I don't remember if that was an actual glitch or it was just like an actual thing he could do, but it's hilarious either way. The problem when they got into Fae was that they were just completely awful. Melody got in as a generic Lance Flyer who is still a pity breaker, who, if I remember correctly, is due for a refine sooner or later, but at the moment she's worse than pretty much a lot of the other relatively accessible units that we have. Percival got in and he was okay, but he got immediately crept by Sirius, who is still better than him to this day. Percival did end up getting a refine, and it wasn't bad by any means, but the available inheritance options that we did have were just significantly better than what he got in his refine. So at the very least, he's just a more budget generic cav, even though he's a 5-star. I would say out of the three though, Rutger probably got the best treatment for his time. He started out as a really mediocre sword grail unit with no PRF, mid attack, and really high speed, but ended up getting a really amazing refine that eventually became an arcane, aka Arcane Devourer. But for the time being, it had breath, it had damage reduction, it had slaying, a lot of attack and speed. He was really living up to the name of the Critger just because of how good that weapon was at the time. And it's still relatively good to this day. The problem is that it's just now an inheritable and everybody can replicate his niche. That's less on Rutger though, and more on the fact that IS decided to gimp him like that. But as far as FE6 characters were concerned, these were probably some of the most notable downgrades from the mainline to Heroes altogether. Although there are definitely other exceptions to that for sure. I'll get into those much later. But for now, let's talk about Canas, who was pretty much just considered a quote-unquote better Ray, which for anyone who didn't know, Ray was considered one of the worst red tomes and is still considered really mediocre to this day in Heroes. Canas was just a more expensive version who was quote-unquote better, but he also wasn't because Ray ended up getting a PRF before him. Canas in FE7 was a relatively decent mage for what it was worth. He was solid on recruitment, he was easy to promote, and you got him, I think, relatively early. I don't think it was early, but it was at a point where you could still use him to relatively decent success. That wasn't really apparent in Heroes. He was considered one of the worst grails for a long time, and once he got Ancient Codex, aka his PRF, he ended up becoming one of the better grail units that we have in the game. And even to this day, he still wants to keep that weapon because of how much it offers him. It's a really solid weapon overall. And I would definitely say his redemption was a lot better than some of the other units on this list, including Seth and Titania. Seth and Titania were considered some of the best units in their respective titles. Seth has that infamy from Sacred Stones as one of the strongest units in the series. Amazing growth, decent stats, really solid weapon ranks, had the ability to rescue because that was a feature in the GBA games. And with Titania, she was a pre-promote. She could also rescue. She had Kanto. She had good bases. Very simple stuff that made them stand out out very, very well. In Heroes, however, they were treated completely awful before and after the refine too. When they came out, they were both treated with triangle eject weapons, ruby sword, and emerald axe respectively. On their refine, they still got the palette treatment where they kept the base effect, but instead of leaning into their combat, they became more supportive where they both got a variant of tactic. So at the time, both of them were still able to run something like triple tactic strats, which wasn't bad for buffing by any means. The big problem is that it was just a complete far cry from anything else they were able to complete. Both of them had really bad base stats, didn't really get much better over time. They aren't exactly competitive by any means. They have extremely outdated weapons, and unlike Sigurd, who went from being one of the most respected units in the series to still a relatively decent unit, they had a massive fall from grace from their mainline to Heroes. But at the very least, they both got alts that are also both bad. And on the Tellius train, we also have Har, who more or less just got treated like Rutger, who was extremely mediocre on debut, but he ended up becoming really strong. Even to this day, is still considered one of the stronger units that we have in the game, thanks to the amount of new skills that were added this year. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Har in Tellius was known for being a massive flying tank with incredible damage output. He was a flyer, so he had good mobility, he could rescue, he had all the stuff. He was immune to bow effectiveness, although he had lightning magic weaknesses. That also carried over in his refine, which is also funny. They gave him IOTs, but he also ended up getting a dual phase brave weapon with true damage reduction, which at the time was still relatively good, but it wasn't enough for him to stand out, mainly because of his inheritable options at that time. But now, as it currently stands, he's able to take advantage of so many skills that arguably makes him one of the most valuable units in the game currently as a free-to-play player. And it's a really nice glow up from how he first started, especially since he was known for being an incredible unit in his base game. Same thing with Sheeta, although she definitely fell off way later down the road, but she didn't exactly start great either. FE11 Sheeta was known for having Wing Spear, which was a very high might effective weapon against cabs and armors. She had flyer benefits akin to Pala, so she could go over mountains and do whatever she needs to do on specific maps, and you could forge the weapon so you can make it hit even harder if needed. In the start of Faye, she obviously didn't have something like that, but she more or less came with a really mediocre attack stat with an armor smasher. I would definitely say once her refine came out, she definitely had a bit more of a surgence just because of her ability to not only target armors and cabs, even with her lowish attack stat, but she also had Flashing Blade built into her weapon, meaning that she could charge specials really easily. I would definitely say it fell off nowadays just because of her lowish attack stat, which didn't really do her any favors as armors and cabs were just becoming more and more bulky, although cabs aren't exactly known for their bulk anyway. The low attack stat never really did her any favors, and that continued on with a lot of her future variants too, whether that was the kid version or the summer version. Even though they both had their own respective gimmicks, it still didn't help that she had a relatively low attack stat. And moving on to Awakening, this one might get me a lot of disagreements, but I'm putting Male Robin on here. Male Robin at the time was probably one of the best units in Heroes, mainly because he was a really good Takumi and Ryoma counter, but that's all he really offered at the end of the day. Again, this is another situation with Sigurd, but in my opinion, just a bit more escalated. This is mainly due to the fact that Robin in Awakening is extremely broken, and while it's not, again, fairest one-to-one comparison, his mediocre stat line on top of the fact that he was really only a dedicated counter for specific units that really didn't stay in the meta all too long anyway due to skill inheritance becoming a thing a bit later, really didn't do him a lot of favors, especially when Hector was the one that continued to stay on the current meta trend for years to come. And his refund didn't really help with it much either because it more so doubled down on what he already came with, but didn't really add anything to his combat outside of visible stats, which at the time was probably okay, but it definitely didn't do much in the long term. I will say, for what it's worth though, if you were to give him all sorts of inheritables nowadays, he could probably kill any Hector if you need him to, which is funny in its own right. Otherwise, we have Camilla, Saber, and lastly, Edelgard. The main thing with Camilla is that she was a pre-promoted unit with good base stats, very simplistic stuff. She never really falls off for the most part, and with a lot of reclassing, you could end up making her a really powerful unit in Fates, especially with how many tools there are in the game. In Heroes, she had an okay enough start, and her refund wasn't bad by any means, although somewhat similarly to Sheeta, her stats just could not keep up, and outside of her supportive gimmick, which could have just been replicated by a lot of other units, it didn't really do her a lot of favors, and she inevitably just fell off. Although, with 8 Camillas in the game, I think a lot of people wouldn't be hard-pressed if 1 or 2 of them were bad. Meanwhile, with Saber, he also was a relatively decent unit in Shadows of Valentia. He had solid stats, you got him early game, you can make him a Dread Fighter. Dread Fighter on its own is already extremely good. Saber was pretty good. In Heroes, I would not say as much, at least at the time. He started out as a generic infantry sword, which means that you would pretty much build any 4-star at that point, because it was a lot easier to build them. He did get a refine soon after, which did give him slaying with conditional distant counter if his special was ready and stats, which funnily enough was just a slightly weaker version of Ike's refine, which wasn't good when that came out. But while the refine itself wasn't the grandest when it first came out, it did end up aging a bit better just because of future inheritables that we would get. That being said, you probably wouldn't use it nowadays just because of the weapon options he has access to. And for what it's worth, he did have a bit of time to shine, which I think is still better than a lot of other units. And lastly, there's Edelgard. Edelgard was extremely good in 3 houses because she had Raging Storm, and Raging Storm with Amar was really dumb. Meanwhile, in Heroes, she did eventually get it in a refine, but when she first started out, she had a Sling Axe with a guaranteed follow-up with a weird condition, but at the very least, she did end up becoming significantly better because of the refine. And it's not like she was missing out on Raging Storm, because every subsequent alt that came out pretty much had it, whether that was built into the weapon, including her refine, or it was just in her B slot. And one of the best Gale Force units, even to this day, is a version of Edelgard, because she's able to go 3 times in 1 turn, which is really excessive at points. But when she first got in, she wasn't too bad. I wouldn't say she was bad, but she definitely wasn't on the same level as she was in 3 houses. And again, it is a bit more difficult to do one of those 1-to-1 comparisons, but I think as far as units are concerned across the series, these are probably some of the most notable examples that were added into Fae and become weaker as a result. But if I did miss any notable examples, let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.